Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Last night, I went to see a movie known as Player One, in which it shows a continued huge generation of people hooked into a place known as virtual reality as they come collectively together to indulge in a place called the Oasis. And it got me thinking about something that I see as an unusual phenomenon in the last couple of decades, and that is that we have the millennial generation. That is that generation born between 1980 and 1998 who are facing overwhelming personal economic stagnation due in part to such things as large college debt and intense career competition. The result is that many of these millennials are suffering from depression, anxiety, social isolation, suicide, bullying, internet and social media addiction, as well as entitlement leading to emotional and social dysfunction. Boy, that seems like a lot to be laying on a generation today. So the question is there an opportunity for healing that trauma within the millennial population? And is it possible that if the parents of this millennial generation do their work to heal their own trauma, which it is believed these millennials may have inherited? Joining us here on the program today is someone who's going to be joining us to talk about how we can maybe do this very thing, which is known as intergenerational healing. She is the co-founder of Gatekeeper Constellations, which is located in Corvallis, Oregon. We're joined by two guests today, Catherine Van Wetter and Joe Arnold. Catherine, Joe, thank you for being on the program today.
Thanks, Daniel. It's a pleasure.
Yes, thanks, Daniel.
Now, how do you tackle this problem? Is it really that these millennials are just kind of dealt an unusual card in life, or do you think they started out just like the rest of us and we're just kind of finding excuses for them?
Well, it's interesting because I've been researching the different generations. There's 5 generations right now within the United States, and each generation in and of itself seem to have an issue that they carried. And when I look at the millennials right now and the heaviness of what they're carrying, as you mentioned, the depression and social anxiety, there's a part of me that looks at our culture as a collective and how easy it can be to point our fingers at one generation being a certain way and another generation being another way. And in some ways, it feels like each generation becomes an entity within itself and not part of the whole. And so looking at what the millennials are dealing with and coming from the place of systemic constellation work, it feels like it's really important for us as parents of millennials to really take a look at where our own trauma is and how we may have attributed to how the millennials are today.
Joe, feel free to step up whenever you feel indulged.
Thanks. I do agree with Catherine and what she said, and I have been reflecting on my own children who are of the millennial generation and also reading more about the influences on the millennial generation. And one of the things that struck me that was unusual was the participatory trophies where kids were offered these great kind of kudos. Yes, you're a wonderful person and everything you do is great and thank you for being alive and how wonderful it is that you're here. And I just wonder if that has contributed to that almost kind of for me generation that I expect as a millennial to get that job and to be promoted every couple of years regardless of my performance, which leads us, myself included, in this older boomer generation to look at the millennials and wonder why they became that way.
You know, and here's the thing. Now, I've been out there quite a bit, and I've been wondering about this whole millennial phenomenon as well, you know, this sense of entitlement and, you know, the idea that they're kind of waiting for people to give them things because they just feel that that's the way it should be. And I'm seeing a lot of millennials, though, that are pretty highly motivated, that are out there making their own way, and they've broken away from their parents, and they're doing their own thing. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I remember some people in my generation that were just as lazy as the ones we're kind of pointing the fingers at here, that are still sitting in their hometowns after graduation, not doing much with their lives. And so you kind of got to wonder, you know, are we making this all up, or does it really exist?
I think one issue that I know that I'm paying more attention to is not clumping together a whole generation as being a certain way. And I remember when I used to teach positive discipline classes to boomers, part of it was what we recognize as parents, baby boomer parents, was that many times we wanted to be best friends and playmates with our children, which is not a place for a parent to be with a child. And so looking at the child as doing no wrong, they become pleaser junkies instead of coming from the inside of the encouragement which recognizes that they're doing well in the world. And so as you mentioned, there are people within the boomer generation who are lazy, and when I look at millennials, I have two sons, and both of them are on different trajectories. And one son is out in the world being an engineer, and the other son is going to Japan to teach English as a second language. And from a perspective of a parent, I've seen them work hard individually in who they are. And so when I hear millennials being clumped together as being a certain way, it's really disheartening.
Yeah, I agree with you. You know, at first I found myself, I remember some years back as we were beginning to touch on this, and I thought, well, okay, it was easy for me to see what we were being told about, let's say, this generation here, and perhaps it's like a lot of us as we get older, let's start picking on the young. I mean, that's what horror movies are based on. Let's just kill the youth. I mean, they're dumb. They can't figure things out. But then again, most of the youth wouldn't be in situations like that in the first place. But what do we do about this? Where does this healing begin? You talk about intergenerational, that the parents need to do their work too. Where does this all really begin?
Well, I think in part it begins with each person individually looking at areas in their life that may be unresolved in the area of trauma, which epigenetics, the study of genetics, has shown that we carry trauma as far back as 14 generations. So each generation, unless they've done their own resolution, their own resolving of their trauma, they will, because of who they are, pass that on to their children. And now more than ever, it feels like one needs to really take a close look at themselves instead of pointing the finger out at how people are not serving them, or how, in this case, the millennials are so narcissistic and entitled. What part of myself have I been narcissistic, or have I been entitled? What part of myself contributed to how this generation as a whole has turned out? And as we know, with the current situation in the United States, we have representation of narcissism out there and of entitlement. And so those, in some ways, are the heroes that people look out at. So again, pulling it back into self, how do we become more responsible for where we are in our life and how we raise our children, as well as being accountable?
Any thoughts, Joe?
Well, I was thinking about the epigenetic aspects of how our millennial generation inherited trauma through their DNA, and this is now scientific. There's now scientific proof to support this idea. So how do we deal with that? What is the actual origins of the trauma? And one of the things that I came to understand through all this research was the things that we're battling right now as a nation are war and immigration. So if I go back all the way to my parents, where my father is in that traditionalist generation, or sometimes called the silent generation, and he did not fight in any wars, but he was born in 1939, so as a child he went through World War II. So there was war and the trauma of war, and even veterans coming back from World War II, and then ultimately he was in the generation of Vietnam and the same thing. Then we had a mass immigration. His parents were born in Germany and immigrated to this country. So there's immigration that is a physical trauma that people experience when they have to leave their homeland, be it by sort of the government expulsion or they're leaving to find better opportunities. They leave past their homeland. And in constellation work, the immigration, especially across oceans, is traumatic to people. And then to experience the wars at the same time, more physical trauma. And if that's not resolved within that generation, that then becomes an emotional DNA, because it becomes embedded in the emotional DNA passed on to the next generation. So then my father passed that on to me, and I didn't know how to work with that because I wasn't aware of it. And now I'm aware more of my own epigenetic emotional trauma. So if I don't work on that in the boomer generation, guess who gets it? My children. They get to express their trauma in whatever way it manifests because I haven't worked to heal the trauma that I got passed on. And now if I sat down as a boomer and really explored that deeper trauma and healed that trauma, then my children wouldn't have to inherit it. And that could change the entire course of the world.
Well, there's something that's also important to note, too, which you brought up there, Joe, especially about the silent generation and the idea of war and war veterans, is that you're looking at several generations here of families without fathers. You know, this is a situation where these fathers may have died in the war, or they could be just, let's say, bastard children from some, you know, service people who had children without knowing about it, you know, but here you have fatherless sons and daughters out there. So that's also another way that trauma could be passed on as well, correct?
Yes, and when we look at a family that a child is born into, we have what we would refer to as invisible loyalties or attachment to both father and mother. And when a father, as you brought up, is not present, it can be really hard for a child to grow up in a world and have a sense of who they are, or to have what we would refer to as a backbone, to stand up and be able to confront what's in front of them. And being a child that does not have that, you know, I look at, for instance, the term narcissism. What a narcissist is many times is they could be what we would call a hollow body. There's not a real sense of who they are inside, so they look outside themselves for validation, hence what many of the millennials are said to do with all the selfies and getting the kudos from outside of themselves. So in ways of looking at the millennial condition right now, it's complicated and it's multi-layered, and certainly something that will take a while to be able to pull apart what all the different factors are.
Now, other manifestations, too, could be things such as ADHD, ADD. We're talking about diagnosable or undiagnosable chronic illnesses. I mean, there's a whole slew of things. How can we know those aren't just environmental?
Well, I sometimes feel that people who get diagnosed with those different ailments or diagnoses, I know from a perspective of being a mental health clinician, my sense is sometimes people get misdiagnosed because they might be highly sensitive. So then they show up as ADHD for lack of another way to figure out what's going on with them. And again, when we go back into physical trauma, wherever our own Achilles tendon, so to speak, is, wherever our own vulnerability is, it may show up as mental discord, it may show up as depression, anxiety, and then from there it gets pathologized into a mental health issue. And so working with somebody who's been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, coming from the perspective of systems work, to look to see what contributing factors brought them to that point of diagnosis, and to look at the trauma that they may be carrying that shows up as not being able to sit still, or being confused and conflicted, or even with the narcissistic diagnosis that people get, to really drill down into what the core issue is.
So let's just say we put all this aside for just a moment, and both of you tackle this one. What should a well-developed human being's activities or behaviors really be in the world?
Well, there's an amazing element of responsibility for the self. So how does that translate into their activities or the way that they actually associate with the world? To me, it's like that there has to be this sense of seeing the hope that's there and not dwelling so much on all the negative. and taking personal responsibility for how one advances their life in the world, if you will, is a key component, because if everybody's waiting for somebody else to do something, nothing's ever going to happen. And so, I mean, I just take a look at the Z generation going now into a different generation, how these people stood up for all the killings that are happening in schools. They're yes, it's a negative thing to have a shooter come into a school, but how they turned that around, took personal responsibility and stepped forward and created these amazing marches all over the world about taking the responsibility to do something and not just sitting back waiting for somebody else to take care of it, because that's never going to happen. And that's one of the ways that I see how people can advance themselves in the world, and dealing with the trauma of what they've been passed down. This is their manifestation. Not a bad manifestation to stand up to deal with the trauma they've inherited.
And with that also, the recognition that there's a primary incentive, or there's the birthright of many to feel like they have a place, they're significant in what they do, and that their voice is heard. And when I look at, for instance, the Generation Z who have stood up and are doing what many of the adults have failed to do in their eyes, I see children in some ways, it's really not their part to be having to do this, yet they're the ones who feel like they're going to be the voice of change. And so again, this shows the trickle down of unresolved trauma when we just start pointing our fingers and blaming each other for what the other hasn't done. And children need to be in a school setting where it's safe for them. And how is it that they've come up in masses right now to say no more? And as a collective, how do we all, as Joe said, take the responsibility and not keep passing the ball on to somebody else?
You know, this also brings up something I found to be a unique phenomenon, and that was during the presidential election, Donald Trump becoming president and being up in Portland, Oregon when they had all the rallies after that had happened. And, of course, what it seemed to be was a bunch of people that started out with what seemed to be the right intentions. Oh, we're upset because this guy's in office, and this happens with every president. But then, of course, it morphs into let's start destroying office buildings and property and injuring people. And it turns out that this big horde of people that was down there rallying cry against Donald Trump, more than 70% of them didn't even bother to vote in the first place.
Yeah, and isn't that a state of agitation when people do things that cause harm to others? And it feels like we're at such a crucial point in our evolution to really, again, as trite as it may seem, to look inside oneself and see what we can do as a betterment of our culture and of our own consciousness. And yes, they'll be the ones who are out there burning things down and spewing hatred and anger, and looking at how we've evolved as a country, being the youngest country in the world, and in many ways our archetype is hero and bully. How do we come and take our place as being ones who can learn that perhaps how we're going in this life is not in the right direction? How do we access the wisdom of those who came before us? And right now we're at such a tipping point to either devastate each other with the actions that are happening or rise like the phoenix. And so with all the combustion and all the blaming and everything that's happening, it feels in many ways that it's also a wonderful opportunity to, again, go inside and look to see how we individually and as a collective can make a difference. And that's not being self-centered. That's coming into places where we are harboring the anger and the resentment and the trauma of the past. How do we make that, metamorphosize that into something that will be beneficial? And that's the quest.
So now that we've really pinpointed and open up, how we look at all of this, how is it that your work perhaps helps people meet and overcome these challenges?
Well, a lot of the approach that I know Joe and I take, I've looked at and studied how indigenous cultures work with situations, work within their own culture, and have found that if we can hold people in the space of honoring and witnessing someone's story, honoring and witnessing the interconnection and the similarities that we have with each other, it enables us to move forward in a way that will free us from things that have kept us trapped. Working with systemic constellation work, we move away from the psychological instead of talking about what's going on and trying to make sense of it and getting validation. The reason why we are the way we are is because we didn't get the love we needed as children, et cetera, et cetera. The approach that we do within systemic constellation work is we look within the system of an individual and a system within the family, and from there be able to drill down again into what trauma somebody is carrying. And as a group, we can move through and help somebody resolve that. Joe, do you want to?
Well, that was an interesting question, and I'm still back on the ADHD and ADD, and I'm thinking that when trauma is not recognized within an individual, the manifestation of that trauma can be many different things. And we watched an interesting documentary about Adderall and how people use Adderall to focus. And Adderall is a drug that's administered by the drug companies, and how many college students use it because they become bored. And when they become bored, they tend to not focus. So that can be misconstrued because they're going from one thing to the next, the next, to the next, to the next as ADHD or ADD, but in reality, they're just so bored that they can't stick on one thing. When they take Adderall, they actually focus in on what they want to achieve. Now, if that is a manifestation of emotional trauma into physical trauma, then that could be addressed, whether it's by the individual that's actually experiencing it or by the generations prior going through their own process. And I can cite an example that was really amazing about how this process can work. A friend of mine did a wonderful constellation where he had a bum left leg, and he'd been limping all his life. Doctors never could figure out why it was. So he came into a constellation because he was sort of at his wit's end. And I want this to go away. He's in his 50s. And so when we went through the process of this constellation, we discovered one of his distant ancestors. When they fought in the Civil War, the brother had gone to work to fight in the South, and the rest of the family fought in the North. So they actually disowned this brother. He later had his leg blown off. He later had his left leg blown off, and the manifestation all the way down through the generations to this friend of mine was his left limpy leg. So once they actually came to conclusion, and people were put back in what we call orders of love, the brother was brought back into the family, and the energy that opened up to heal manifested in him. 2 weeks later, his limp went away.
Wow. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, find science trying to point the finger and say, well, we can't figure that one out.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty fascinating stuff. Now, kind of give me an idea what you mean by constellation. And I don't want to use the word therapy, but if we need to, just to kind of surround it there, what is this constellation that you're talking about?
Catherine will be really good at explaining that.
Well, constellation, when everything is made up of a system, and within every system is what we call a constellation, which means that different elements are in their place. For instance, within the constellation of a family, there is a father, there is a mother, there are children, and there could be abandonment, there could be abuse. When we actually set a constellation, we begin to focus in on an area in someone's life where they're not striving. It could be work, it could be wanting to have a better relationship with their sibling, it could be wanting to have more money coming in. And so we focus in on an area that is stopping somebody from living their life well. And every family system has, within the constellation, has its own consciousness. So in many ways, we're living constellations. We're walking around in our life, always in a constellation. pulling in relationships that serve us, having work that we may or may not like. So the constellation is, when we actually do the work, is to be able to focus in on an issue or a trauma that somebody wants to get more clarity on.
And I would add to that the facilitator, which would be Catherine in this case, gets to address the client's trauma, whether it's remembered in this lifetime or if it's not remembered in this lifetime and they don't even have any idea what the trauma is. Representatives are put in place in the process of doing a constellation that represent these different factions of themselves, whether it be actual family members like my friend with the limpy leg, or it be another situation where people were representing nations or events in history. And those are all constellations because they actually move like the constellations in the sky. They move in relationship to one another. And when everything is in a perfect place and you see the constellation clearly, that's when healing happens. So even looking up into the sky, if you looked at the Leo constellation as an example at a particular time of the year, and you could see it clearly, if you can read the stars like that, it's really impressive. When the constellation moves around in the sky to a point where it's kind of fuzzy, you don't see it, then you just have to believe that it's there. Whereas in constellation work, when people are in the morphogenic field, they actually move around in relationship to one another, and that actually starts to create an energetic movement. And then Catherine would come in and say, oh, I understand here in relationship, this person, this representative in relationship to this representative means something. She'll actually get them to speak a truth statement if it works for them. And the client, who's actually picked someone to represent themselves, they're in the constellation as well. And so they're all moving around in this constellation, the morphogenic field, which is basically where everybody stands inside the circle. And they all relate to one another, not with words, but with energy and feeling. And that has more impact when people don't understand what their trauma is. I can't name my trauma. I've gone to psychotherapy for my entire life, and I haven't really figured out where my trauma is. So constellation work reveals the trauma energetically. And 99% of the time, the client feels what's happening and then gets to translate that into how they're going to heal. Does that make any sense?
You know, it does, and I think it's very unique that you have both said consistently, it really doesn't matter what your trauma is per se as far as identification, okay?
Right.
You know, therapists love spending a lifetime making careers out of people who really don't have a clue why they're there. You know, keep coming to see me, we'll figure this out, but thanks for the McMansion. But in this case here, you're saying, look, you know, you just kind of feel something is off. Well, that's a good start. So let's see how we can realign this and what happens. And the energy will speak all on its own. Is that kind of a way to look at it?
Yeah, you know, and I mean, I have a master's in social work. I've been, as I said, a mental health clinician in the past, and I've had my own share of talk therapy, and I know many talk therapists who are excellent at what they're doing. I also recognize that because we carry our trauma in our bodies, sometimes talking through it, we are not going to resolve it because our body has been referred to as our unconscious. And if we can tap into an unconscious part of ourselves that may be holding a trauma or may be holding the reason why we're not in a healthy relationship, when we can look at it from the perspective that however we're showing up in life, it's really there to protect us. This is not about diagnosing. This is not about making something bad. It's about recognizing how we operate in our life has served us, and an overuse can cause us harm, such as depression can serve us when the world gets to be too much. We pull in and we shut down. Overuse, it can cause us harm, but when we can recognize that our body and how it shows up and how we carry our trauma is there to help us, it allows for the resiliency to come forward. And what I know with this work is that oftentimes people who have been labeled and diagnosed with all kinds of symptoms and bipolar and schizophrenic, you name it, all down the gauntlet, that when they recognize what they're carrying sometimes is not theirs, or that what they're feeling is true and spot on for the first time, they're validated for what they've always known to be true. And so having the honor to work with somebody who has been so saddled with shame and grief and anger and resentment and suicidal ideation, etc., when they can recognize that they are perfect in how they are, all we need to do is go in and remove some things that aren't theirs and to alleviate the heaviness. I don't know if I answered your question. I kind of went on a little bit.
No, actually, you put a lot of clarity into it because it reminded me of a quote that I usually attribute to Dr. Bernie Siegel, but I know it's not him. In fact, I asked him, he says, well, I don't remember actually saying that, but I like it. And he says, but the quote goes something like, just think of billions of years of evolution. Okay, just think, I mean, that is a lot of time for something to kind of evolve and get something right, or at least successful anyway. And when you think about those terms, nobody can screw up quite like you can.
Yeah.
I'd like to relate something that Catherine said about not knowing and not holding on to what is yours. I did it when I was trained to be a facilitator for constellation work. There was a constellation called in by this woman whose children were just had all of a sudden started fighting each other, this boy and this girl, just bam, 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 and she had tried everything. She came to a constellation, and it turns out that her great-grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, and her husband's great-grandfather was a Nazi German who had been pulling the lever, as it were. And when he brought that into the morphogenic field, the two faced each other. And what Catherine likes to do is she actually has people bow deeply to one another to honor their place in either history or in the family or in the situation the person's experiencing, and recognize that they did the best they could with where they were. So this Nazi officer and this Holocaust survivor bowed to one another and accepted where they were. And then with that healing, that was just a couple of generations back, within a couple of days, the woman reported their kids stopped fighting with one another. So that's how the healing can affect the next generation.
And I would like to also add that this work is about love and this work is about life. And when we move from the place of love, part of what we look for when working with somebody within a group or individually is where there's been what we would call an interruption of love, where there was a loss in the family and the family didn't honor it, where a child died and the child was not remembered, where there was a divorce and the person was exiled from the family. These are different instances where there would be what we would call an interruption of love. And part of what this work addresses is where that is. And I always let people know when I work with them that there's love here, even though they may not feel it, there's love here, otherwise they wouldn't be here. And as we carry around so much trauma, not knowing what it is, yet not wanting to wake up and get out of the house every morning, to know that it's not ours and to know that there can be resolution is such a beautiful way to honor where we've come from. And I don't know, the work is phenomenological in many ways in that we're not able to wrap our mind around it. It's more experiential, and that experiential comes out in the stories that we tell when we've had an aha moment to recognize that father, mother didn't mean to do what they did. Because of their own trauma that they carried, they showed up as best they could as parents. If a father is not able to be with the family, to trust and know that the father wasn't able to be there and to look kindly upon them. And this is not a way to bypass emotions or bypass the anger and the grief or the trauma. Instead, it's a way to look at something with more compassion. And when we can do that, then we can start what we would refer to as resolution, because history repeats itself unless there's resolution. We see it with the wars. We see it with our veterans coming home. We're seeing it with the broken families, the families that aren't feeling resilient. And so recognizing that when we can start resolving an issue, it begins with us, and from there the healing and the forgiveness can begin to happen.
Wow. It's such a lot to take in, and I'm sure the listeners out there are pretty fascinated with this. How can they find out more about connecting with you folks in case they find that they might want to move in this direction?
Well, we have a website called gatekeeperconstellations.com, and there's also YouTube and videos out there, both under Catherine Van Wetter and Catherine Van Wetter. And they can also feel free to contact us.
Any closing thoughts for either of you?
Well, I really appreciate, Daniel, what you're doing, and congratulations on the 14 years of your radio. Thank you for showing up as you are and being such a beautiful spokesperson.
How about that, Joe? Just because you play music, I'm a radio show host.
Hey, wow. Something. And I want to thank you, Daniel, as well, for hosting this and interviewing us. I would say that have healing will travel. We are going down to Reno in about a week to do a workshop in Reno, and we've been contacted from various parts of the country, and it is really fascinating that we have a home base here in Corvallis, but most of our work tends to be outside of the area. I have friends in Florida and some other friends in the Midwest who are interested in this work as well. We just have to figure out how to get more people interested so that we can continue to do this work. For the sake of the world, I mean, this is not really about how good we are. It's really more about how good everybody else can be.
And I agree with that. I remember I had a guest on the program, and there was a piece in her book that I had wrote. And it's funny when you get to a point where you understand something, even though you may have read it or seen it or experienced before, but there's that one time you go, wow, you just profoundly, I get it now. And what she said in her book was this: you will come to a point in your life where whether something is good or whether something is bad, it's all okay. Yeah. And I remember reading that at that time, and I was like, she is absolutely right. There's really no such thing as bad. It's all good. It's amazing stuff.
And there's something really freeing when we can be with where we are in our life right now, where we can consent to the truth of it, what it is right now, neither good, bad, right, or wrong. It is what it is. And with being in that place is where we can move forward and choose life instead of choosing the burdens that we've been carrying.
And then Catherine has the great saying that life is too perfect to be fair.
That's right. Catherine, I want to thank you, and Joe, thank you both as well for sharing this work and for talking about all of this and how people can actually move forward, just continue to enjoy life and not necessarily put things behind them, but certainly embrace and integrate them into a better way, which is completely them. Thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.